Well, it looks like, okay, one more person joined. Um, I think I'm going to go ahead and get started now. I don't want to keep you too long. I have a lot of material. I'd like to tell you about some of my experiences gardening. I was a gardener at the Mamie D. Lee Garden for about 4 years. I have since moved down to Richmond, Virginia, and I no longer have such a nice place to garden. But I'd like to tell you about the strategies that I used. I pretty much grew all the vegetables for myself and for my wife, and I grew vegetables all season long, all year long. So I'd like to talk about what I did. This first slide, which I hope everyone can see the slides, shows my garden plot, and it has several features. There are vertical posts for growing plants vertically. There are row covers, and there are these quick hoops. And I'll go over pretty much the strategy that I used for setting up this garden. I also have some, many of you, I don't know if all of you are, what your gardening experience is and whether you have access to a garden space like this. I also have some slides about container gardening if there's time and interest. So I put those out at the end. And now let's see if I can figure out how to advance the slide. There we go. Okay, so this is just kind of giving you a snapshot of the garden in various times of the year. So the upper left was a picture of the garden January 11th, and I pulled the row covers away, and you could see there's quite a lot of vegetables growing, and there's snow on the ground in the background. So you get an idea that you can really grow some serious vegetables all year long. And the next upper right shows the garden in the spring and May 4th. And then we have another picture November 11th. And finally, a picture in the summer. And I can't even see the date on there. Maybe you know what, you can see the date, sometime in the summer. I mean, we typically think of gardening as a summer activity, but I think the best time to garden is actually in the fall and the winter. And the reason is that the pest problems and the weed problems are pretty negligible, and there's very little watering you need to do. So if you have the constitution to get out there in the cold weather, it's actually a great time to garden. So the first thing I'd like to talk about, and the theme here is how do you really get the most output per unit area of your garden. And so this slide is to illustrate a biointensive garden layout. And there are just a few principles at work here. One is that the beds should be wide. And you can see that I have 5 garden beds in this plot. It's about 12 feet by 25 feet. And the beds are occupying almost the entire garden. So wide beds, and you could be anywhere from 30 inches to 48 inches, depending on how tall you are. I made mine 36 inches. I'm a little under 6 feet. If you're taller, you could make it wider. You just have to be able to reach across the garden without hurting your back.
I'm listening to this thing, but maybe I'll take it on a walk. It's okay, you guys go. I'll be listening to this anyway. Oh.
Yeah, I'm gonna try to mute everybody. Yeah, if you wouldn't mind muting your phones, I'd appreciate that. Thanks. And so then the pathways also can be between 12 inches to 36 inches. 12 inches is on the narrow side. It's really hard to maneuver in such a narrow space. So I typically use 24 inches. If you feel you want more, I guess you could do more. And it's up to you. And then the other aspect is the beds need to be deep. And so you could see here, I've piled soil up, but not only did I pile soil up, I've worked the soil below it. So the roots have a lot of room to grow, and then it should contain organic matter. And I'll go into why in the next few slides. So here's a slide to illustrate why you want wide beds. So the top right, you see a lettuce production field where you want to have a tractors driving up and down that field. And those rows can't be more than about a foot wide. And so our gardens at the Mamie Lee Garden, a full plot is 25 by 25. And so I have illustrated how much growing area you would have depending on how wide your rows are and how wide your paths are. And so if you had eight 1-foot rows with 8 2-foot paths, that would be kind of like what we're seeing in that picture. You're only using 32% of the growing area. And now if you go down into the, didn't mean to do that. If you go down into the lower left, you see I've got 4 beds that are 4 feet wide with 3-foot paths. So that actually gives you a lot of room in between the rows, but those rows are pretty wide. And for me, that would actually be uncomfortably wide, but that gives you 64% growing area. And if you use 4 3-foot by 3 3-foot paths, you'd have 48% of your plot would be growing area. And what I did was 5 3-foot beds with 2 feet in between, and that gives you 60% of the growing area. And you can see next to that last slide a picture of a garden, and that garden, to get rid of this, it's in my way, I can't. It's not really responding. Okay, so you can see that when a bed is wide, you can see how you've got a kind of a green living mulch. And one of the things that does that's so effective is actually once that canopy grows out, it really reduces the amount of weeding you need to do. And weeding is probably the biggest chore that any vegetable grower has to deal with. Okay, we'll talk about that a little bit more. Okay, so I was talking about weeding just before. Weed early, weed often. I mean, that is really a key to success. So I'm showing the same bed on September 30th, and you can see I've transplanted it in some plants, and you're not going to see any weeds growing there. And the reason is if you take care of the weeds on a regular basis, it's pretty easy to weed. And then as that bed, those plants grow, they just fill out and those weeds can't establish. So you need to get in there early, you need to weed often. So I was talking about deep beds, and this comes from a book, someone named John Jeevons. So really, I highly recommend this book. He kind of really was a pioneer in biointensive gardening. And it shows the root mass of various vegetables. And what I really want to highlight, whether it's corn or lettuce, if you look to the left about how deep those roots typically can grow, you see 2 feet deep is on the short side. So if you garden, think about how deep your garden is. A lot of people garden in 6 inches or a foot. But if you can make it so your plants can grow down deeper, you can plant them at a much higher density. And the higher the density, the more plants you can get and the more productivity you'll get per unit area. You know, some of these plants like carrots and beets, their roots can go down as far as 10 feet. So if you're not making it accessible for your plants to go at least a foot, I would say a foot is the minimum, but 2 or 3 feet, you'll really you'll notice the difference. So how do you create deep beds? So one method, and I'm not sure I was going to recommend this. This is a lot of work, but I want to talk about it. It's called double digging. And in double digging, you dig out your trench, and you might dig it out so that it gets to be about a depth of a foot. Oh yeah, I should use my pointer. So here the man is digging. Here's his bed in this area. And now he digs out down to about a foot, and you'll put your soil in a wheelbarrow, and now you'll move it all the way to the far edge of your plot. And then after you dig it out, you'll take a pitchfork, and now you'll just dig. You're not actually digging the soil out, but you stick that in down to the tines, and then you rock back and forth, so you kind of break open the soil bed. So you've dug out a foot, and now you get about another foot this way. And then when you want to start the second bed, then instead of putting this soil into a wheelbarrow, you put the soil back into that first bed, and on, etc. So then when you get to the last bed, that soil that you removed and put in the wheelbarrow, now you add to the last bed you did. So you pretty much break up the ground for about 2 feet, and if you put soil on top of it, and I'll show you where you get that soil from, you basically have got 3 feet of really aerated soil. And why is that so important? It's so important because the roots need air, they need oxygen in order to grow well. And especially if you've got water present in all the air spaces, those plants are going to die. So it's very important to have drainage, and it's very important to have air to your roots. And so deep beds allow the roots to grow down deep and allow you to plant at a higher density, and also help get oxygen into the plant. Okay, so I said I wasn't a real big fan of double digging. I did it once. It's a lot of work. I mean, there are ways of getting, letting nature get a nice bed for you. The downside is that it takes more time. But if you have got the time, then this is something you might try. I've done it and it works pretty well. So say you pick a site, and now what do you have there? If you have lawn or weeds, what you want to do is you want to mow that down, and then you want to spread some steer manure like 2 inches over that area, and that's going to stimulate a lot of worms to the area. It's going to help get things going. Then place a layer of cardboard over that manure, and now you saturate that cardboard with water. That's going to help that cardboard to decay. The cardboard has a lot of fiber, and that actually is a really good soil amendment. And it also now keeps the weeds that were under there from growing. So it doesn't have light. It's pretty much, you're killing the weeds below without doing much work. And then you could just place grass clippings on top of that cardboard, have some shredded leaves in there, so saturate that with water, add some compost and topsoil. So let's say you started this in the spring. So now you've pretty much haven't used that land all summer, and you not going to use it in the fall either. But over that time, from that one spring to the next, most of that stuff that you put down, especially if you use clippings, and if the leaves are shredded, if you use, yeah, if that stuff is, or straw, that breaks down within one season. And by the next season, you could probably plant into that ground. I've become a big proponent of something called no-till, where you don't really disturb the ground unless you have to. And there are nature's cultivators for us, like earthworms. Earthworms cultivate the soil, plants cultivate the soil, and there are some, there's going to be one of the talks is on cover crops, and they'll probably go into this in some detail, but there are some cover crops you can grow. There are these radishes, or like daikon radishes, that I think they even call them sod busters. I mean, if you plant them in the fall and let them just hang out there over the winter, those roots can grow down 2-3 feet and really break up the soil. But it takes some time. So if you're in a hurry and you're strong and you like exercise, double dig. But if you're a little less energetic, sheet mulching and using no-till and adding lots of organic amendments to stimulate earthworms and planting cover crops is a really good way to prepare your soil. So something that I just discovered a little bit more recently, this is actually the front of my house. I'm in Richmond, Virginia now, and I have this big strip of land in front of my house that I'm going to use to make, I've been developing to make it into a pollinator garden. This was the worst soil I have ever seen. It was basically red clay, and hardly anything was even growing in there. And what I've done is maybe some of you are familiar with this, they call them worm towers or compost buckets. I just took some 5-gallon buckets, or and if you can usually get these from various food establishments, like the gray bucket I got from Busboys and Poets. Pickles come in there. So for them, it's just trash. So you can usually get them for free. Or bakeries, like in the third picture over, you see all those white buckets. I got that from a bakery. They get their icing and some of their creams in there. And again, it's just garbage for them. They were happy to give it to me. So I drilled holes in the buckets. And the idea is to make holes that are small enough that rodents can't get through. And so rodents could get through 1/4 of an inch or more. So you want to use a drill bit that's less than that. So like 1/8 of an inch to 3/16, worms can get right through there, or other insects that will do composting. And so the idea was, and this is what I did here, is I buried them like every 4 feet in the front of my yard. And you could see that soil that came out. It's this brown clay. It's really, really compacted. And every week, I have a bag of kitchen scraps it's kitchen scraps, and I basically layer shredded paper, kitchen scraps, and make lasagna up. And I take that out, and every week I put it in a bucket and I just move down the line. And that has made an absolutely incredible difference for my garden. So instead of red clay, I've got black clay, and I also put down shredded leaves on top. And so I must have at least 6 inches of loam now in just like about 1.5 years. No need to add worms. You just take use the worms that are in the ground. That worm population is really building up. That compost, it's in sight, it leaches out. You don't really have to do anything. It just spreads itself, and the worms go into the bucket, they eat stuff, they come out, they pretty much distribute the compost through the garden. So it's been a really satisfying experience for me. And I've covered it with some tiles here for aesthetic reasons. I'm actually going to make some stepping stones to make the garden a little more attractive. But you see the bottom right, I've got some snapdragons growing. The plants are really thriving. And the first year I tried to grow things, nothing grew because I think the soil was too compacted and wet. So this is kind of an aside, but now I'm going to show you some details about putting together a bed. And what I would do, and I experimented with just burying kitchen waste in between my garden rows, and it was kind of messy. And I hadn't thought of putting these buckets in at the time, but that is something that I would recommend doing. And I mean, you could, some people put the buckets right in their plot. I would put it in between the rows. So let me describe what I did here to set up some of this. So I would dig out in between the beds, and I would dig out about 1 foot deep. And that's soil that I am putting on top of my beds. So remember when I was talking about double digging? You know, I went down.
Start making dinner.
I went down about 2
It'll be
feet.
a while. My mom does the same thing.
Hey everyone, could you mute your phones? So I would dig down about another foot, and I would put that on top of the bed. And so now you've gone down relative to the beds. You're really down like 12 to 2 feet. And so see, now I've got some newspaper down there that helps keep some of the weeds down, but you could just pretty much put a bucket on top of that. And what I do is in between the rows, then I added wood chips, and you could pretty much just bury those buckets without doing much extra digging, you know, surrounding it by wood chips. So I add the topsoil and the subsoil on top of the beds. I add some organic matter, cover the bed with weed-free compost, then layer in between the rows the cardboard and the newspaper. Again, that's to help prevent weeds from coming in between the rows. I would add those compost buckets and then fill in between the rows with the wood chips, and you're good to go. Why is it so good to put wood chips between those rows? Well, if you've ever been out in a garden in the rain, and especially when you've got clay soil, it just becomes a muck. It's hard to move. When you've got like 1 foot of wood chips, boy, you feel like you're in paradise there. The water drains away. It's very clean. You don't have all that mud all around. So it reduces flooding. It reduces that anaerobic stress that you might get when there's just too much water. And then that wood chips compost in place there. So, you know, you're constantly having to add wood chips, but you're also making compost there. So that plus the compost that would be exuding out of those buckets into your beds, you're going to get paid lots of dividends. It's really going to improve the nutrient profile of your soil. And, you know, the water that's in between the beds can be utilized by the plants that are growing. Those roots will actually go out in between. So it's a really good way. So remember I said, well, maybe I've got 60% of my bed is a growing area. Well, you've actually have some ecosystem services that are beyond that 60% because they're getting water and nutrients from the space between. Something I neglected to mention, when you make your bed, you never want to step on those beds. So the idea is that all the foot traffic is between the beds, because when you step on the beds, you're compacting the soil, you're kind of destroying everything you've done. So that's That's a pretty key concept I neglected to mention. You never walk on your beds. Okay, so I mean, here's a more of a kind of a finished look. So you see the wood chips and the beds ready to be planted. Well, I mentioned organic matter. Why is that so important? Well, it improves the structure of the soil. It breaks up heavy clay soil. So if you have heavy clay, the simplest way of improving it is to add organic matter. It increases aeration of soil. One of the reasons it does that is it attracts earthworms, and the earthworms are actually doing a job on the soil that you could never do yourself. So, you know, some people like to use rototillers. I don't like to till. I like to try to attract earthworms to do the tillage for me. And like I say, every time when you have plants, when you're growing your garden, those plants also help to improve the tilth of the soil. The roots are growing out through those beds. And when the plant dies and those roots die, then you've got organic matter that's pretty widely distributed. And every year, you should be seeing that your soil gets loose to deeper and deeper, especially if you start using some of those cover crops like the radishes I mentioned. The organic matter increases the water holding capacity of the soil. So compost holds 6 times its weight in water, improves drainage, and it contributes to fertility. And it's also a nutrient storage and slow release. So let's talk a little bit about planting density. So this is a concept that it's simple, but it's not always, you know, intuitively obvious. You know, you can use, if you use equidistant spacing, that maximizes the yield per unit area. And this is a bed, one of my beds that shows what I mean by equidistant spacing. You know, you think of planting in triangles where every line on the triangle is the same. And let me illustrate, okay, one other point I should mention. You know, the actual spacing is dictated by the use. Some people like to grow their vegetables and they're harvesting just babies. Sometimes you harvest what they call cut and come again crops. Like here at this lettuce, you know, if you cut the lettuce, you see where that knife is. I forgot to use my pointer. Here's the knife. The leaf meristem, where the new leaves come out, is below it. So if you cut off here, you're going to get new leaves coming out. And so you can just whack across, and then you could come back in a couple weeks and you'll have more leaves to get. One of the things about lettuce, you know, I don't like cut it and come on lettuce, because each time as the lettuce gets older, it becomes tougher, and it has latex in it that's bitter, and I don't like the quality of lettuce that is that way. But like Asian greens, I think is really great to harvest just as a cut and come, and harvest the outer leaves and let the new leaves keep coming along. So depending on what you want to do, whether you just want mature plants or babies, would dictate what your actual spacing should be. So here's an illustration of how you can pack more plants in the same area by using equidistant spacing. So let's suppose you use a spacing of 6 inches. So see how this is in a triangle? These are triangles that are 6 inches apart. You know, you can get 65 plants in 10 rows if in a 3 foot by 5 foot bed. You know, look, if you planted them in a grid, so now I have 9 rows of 6. Now these are 6 inches apart, and these are 6 inches apart, but this hypotenuse is not 6 inches apart. It's more than that. And so that's where you're not getting as many plants in. So I could get 65 plants with optimal spacing. Here, I've got suboptimal spacing because some plants are further apart in this dimension, and so I'm only got 54 plants. So that's a simple concept. I think you need to look at it to make it make sense to you. But look, I've got 11 more plants in the same amount of area. Okay, let's talk a little bit about companion plants, and they serve several roles. One thing, especially if you're growing plants that need to be pollinated, you really want to attract pollinators to your garden. And so there are certain plants that are they add an aesthetic quality and they attract pollinators. They help increase the diversity in your garden. So if you grow the same thing over and over again, and I'm going to talk a little about this more about crop rotation, you're just going to get insects and diseases that are just going to destroy your crop. So they increase the diversity, and they help attract some beneficial insects as well. And I would encourage you, if you're going to do gardening, to kind of get familiar with the insects that are out there. There are some insects that are really bad. This is a cabbage moth. It is a cabbage worm that will just overnight destroy your brassica plants. Some of you may have seen tomato hornworm. They also have a larva that can really do damage on your tomatoes or plants in the nightshade family. But I remember when I first started gardening, and this is actually from my garden, and I had this looks like a Brussels sprout that was eaten by one of these cabbage worms, and I saw these yellow, it looks like it has to do with insects. They're actually pupae, and I was wondering if they were the pupae from the cabbage worm, but I didn't kill them, and it took me a while to figure out what they were, but they turns out to be this braconid wasp. And that braconid wasp, they're attracted to these cabbage worms, and they inject, it's like alien, they inject their eggs into the worm, and then the larvae grow and they eat the worm from the inside out, and then they emerge. And that's what you're seeing here. These are the larvae, and they eventually turn into these pupae, which forms the wasp. So those are a good thing. I don't think there's enough of them to really make a difference for your crop, but I think it's important to know what the insects are that are out there, which ones are good and which ones are bad. And don't just try to kill everything. Okay, so how do you control insects? I think one of the most effective ways of controlling insects without using pesticides are row covers. And in this case, I've got a row cover. This is winter squash, and winter squash needs to be pollinated. And so the row covers can only be on for a short time, but the idea is that you help get the plant established and get it large enough so when the insect comes, that plant is able to better withstand it. One of the worst things about some of the plants is not so much what the plant does, what the insect does to the plant, is the insect acts as a vector that infects the plant with viruses that just destroy the plant. And so you're not really hurting as much from the insects eating the plant as the disease that the insects spread. So if you get a more mature plant before that virus comes along, you'll be okay. Then there are some tricks. There are, cucumbers need to be well, some cucumbers need to be pollinated. Some cucumbers will develop, the fruits will develop without pollination. And that's something that I have successfully used in the garden. When you garden there's not, I'm only so grateful for the opportunity to have been able to garden in the community gardens and having the city, and in this case, it's a national, is it a national park? Some national something. It's a really tremendous blessing to be able to use that. But in community gardens, people do not follow really great hygienic practices, and the disease and insect pressure is enormous. And so I could not grow cucumbers without row covers. And I started growing these cucumbers that were what they call parthenocarpic, so the fruit develops without pollination. And so I could grow the whole life cycle under the row covers and got tremendous yields. And several other people started doing it. After I told them of my success with that, and it really worked out well. So row covers can really be a tremendous blessing. So basically, you see these quick hoops. These are just PVC pipes that are stuck into the ground and then bent over, and they were a great surface to put a row cover over. And I basically grew all my plants under row covers almost the entire year. This is a material called Agribon, and not only does it keep the insects out, and you can see these plants here, these are brassicas that have absolutely no insect damage on them. It increases the humidity. The plants seem to like that. It also gives you some frost protection. And there are different kinds of Agribon, and you could get different amounts of frost protection depending on the number. Okay, so row covers. Yeah, so here, here's some close-ups of the plants growing under that. They are completely clean. And my colleagues that don't have row covers, they, have all sorts of holes in their plants. Some plants, like, I don't know if any of you like amaranth, flea beetles like them too. And, you basically just have Swiss cheese if you try to grow them without a row cover. Okay, so an important consideration is crop selection. You really need to consider the space, the costs, the taste, and the pests when you make your choices about what you put in the garden. There's some plants that have a long season and they take up lots of space, and you really want to have some discipline. If you plant them, you're just going to be planting a lot less of others. And like corn, for example, corn has to be planted in a block in order to be pollinated. Corn has lots of other problems too, because the raccoons love them, birds love them, and insects love them. And so they bring a lot of headaches. Cabbage, that's a big plant that stays in the ground a long time, and it's relatively inexpensive in the supermarket. So, that's something I personally, I never grew cabbage or cauliflower or broccoli. Melons I grew because I love them, but again, it's difficult to grow melons because the space they take, and there's lots of disease on melons as well. I grew parsnips and rutabaga. That's where I decided my taste wins, and but parsnips stay in the ground for several seasons. So if you plant them in the summer, you might harvest them in the winter. So other things, some people like to play around with commodity crops like small grains, wheat and barley, sorghum, oats, millet, rice. Well, you cannot compete with the cost of what another farmer grows. And then there's really not a premium of getting them fresh. So I would not recommend in a small urban garden to grow any of those things. Soybeans, lentils, split peas, peanuts, chickpeas, canola, sesame, quinoa, chia, not recommended. You know, you want to consider taste. I can't stand okra. I know many of you love it, so, and a lot of gardeners had it.
This guy doesn't like okra either. I think this actually might be a good one for us to watch. Yeah.
Okay.
One of the things he was talking about was growing like brassicas for broccoli and Brussels sprouts and stuff, and his recommendations.
Oh, okay. Like running?
Like row covers. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Okay. I think somebody's not on mute here. I wonder if you could, if you meant to be speaking to the group or not. The other consideration that I will mention about crop selection has to do with rotation. There are some families of plants, and they have the most popular vegetables in them, like the nightshade families, tomato, eggplant, peppers, potatoes, or brassicas, hundreds of different varieties of brassica. You know, the cabbage, cauliflower, broccoli, and Asian greens, arugula, mustards, and the squashes and melons, cucumbers are in another family, just have pretty serious disease problems or insect problems. And so you really have to use a lot of restraint. It's so easy to say, okay, I just want to plant tomatoes and peppers in my garden. But if you do that every year, you're just going to have worse and worse results. The yields are going to go down. You're just going to build up so many their root-borne diseases. In particular, like the brassicas, there's a disease of brassica called club root that once it's in your ground, you can't plant brassicas there for probably about 8 years before you get rid of it. So, you know, there's a lot of mixed opinions about the necessity of rotating your crops. You know, to some, I think it's pretty important to rotate these families, nightshade, brassicas, the squashes and melons, and so to use restraint so that you don't plant too much of them. So you have to think about, and I'm going to go over in a little bit about how to make a rotation table and, you know, a strategy. And I think it really takes a lot of discipline not to plant your whole garden in just those families. So another consideration is the season. You know, in the summer, you don't want to plant cool season crops. What are cool season crops like? Spinach, brassicas, lettuce, carrots. They are just not going to grow in your garden in the summer. But like I say, they grow amazing in the spring and the fall. And think about growing over several seasons. And then the warm season, tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, they don't grow when it's below 50 degrees. When the soil temperature is below 50, they are not going to grow. Some people like to get their tomatoes in as early as possible, but they're just going to sit there while you could be growing a cool season crop. So that's just something to keep in mind. You know, don't really jump the gun. There's really not a whole lot of stuff that grows in the warm season, in my opinion. And especially if you've got to temper what you can grow about the tomatoes, the peppers, the eggplants, the cucumbers, the melons. You just can't, if you want to be conscientious about rotating your crops and you've got to kind of limit those, you know, you'll realize that the spring and the fall is where it's at when it's gardening. So let's talk a little bit about some particulars here. I mentioned that like peas are a cool season crop. You could plant them in the spring or the fall, but the spring is definitely the better time to plant a crop like peas. Why? Because the plants are very resistant to the cold, but the flowers are very sensitive. So if you plant them in the spring, those plants are just going to be happy as can be. They don't flower till it's warmer out. But if you plant them in the fall, then you run the risk of your frost ruining your harvest, because right when you want to harvest the peas, the flowers might get ruined. So that's peas. But then there are some plants where it's just the opposite, like a lot of the brassicas or carrots and parsnips. They love the frost. In fact, when you get frost, the plants are fine, and it actually improves the taste of the vegetable that you eat. So those are much better to plant in the fall. Okay, so that's just kind of some rough guidelines. You can really extend your growing season if you choose your crops wisely and plant them at the appropriate time. Okay, so I'm not sure how familiar you are with some of these plants. I just wanted to show you some pictures of plants that maybe, like I keep mentioning Asian greens. You know, Asian greens and could include some types of mustards. One mustard, it's really delicious. You know, you think sometimes you think of the American mustard, like here, these are mustards, really hot and spicy. Mizuna is a mustard. It's beautiful looking and it's very mild, so you can just eat that fresh in a salad. And then there's another plant called Tatsoi. Tatsoi, it's kind of like a cross between a mustard and I think a cabbage. It is a beautiful plant and incredibly delicious. So I just love to plant Tatsoi. You probably see that in the farmer's market. Here's some leafy greens that you might not be familiar with. There's one called Mache, M-A-C-H-E. It grows, it's a very small plant, but it's very cold tolerant. It's also very delicious. So that's a good plant to plant in the fall that will grow over the winter, and then you could harvest in the winter and the early spring. And here's another one in that same category called miner's lettuce or Claytonia. So there's a lot of different kinds of crops out there that, depending on your interest, if you want to try growing in the fall and the winter, those and spinach are really amazing. Okay, I mentioned crop rotation. So there are lots of schools of thought about how you should rotate your crops. I like to use this model based on the nutrient requirements of the crop. So I like to plant my beds in a given family. So let's suppose one bed has the legumes. Legumes are things like peas and beans. And another might be composites, or composites would be like lettuce, or I don't know if some of you like chrysanthemum greens. I love them. Those are composites. Spinach and beets. If it's in a different family, Swiss chard is also in that family. If it's in black, that means that the rotation is not as important. So you can cheat, and the consequences are not going to be as severe as if you don't rotate these families that are in red, the cucurbits, the nightshades, and the brassicas. And so something else that is going on with this rotation is that they're in the order of their nutrient requirements. So the highest requiring nutrient plant are the brassicas. And then comes the nightshades, and then come the cucurbits, and then come like the lettuce and the spinach and the beets are not as nutrient demanding. And then the legumes, many of you know, legumes actually add nitrogen back to the soil. So if you plant a legume, then you don't even have to add as much nitrogen in the following season. So this is kind of like the order of nutrient requirements from 5 going down to 1. So let's suppose I planted it in this order in year one, legumes in bed one, etc. In year two, I would move, whoop, didn't mean to do that. In year two, I would plant brassicas in bed one. And so now brassicas has followed the legumes. They're the most nutrient requiring, and the legumes are the most they're replenishing. So then I'm planting the legumes in bed two. And so bed two in prior years has had, cucurbits, nightshades, and brassicas in it. So this is kind of the end of the line. So now the soil has been, has depleted. And so now legumes go in to restore bed two, etc. So that's the strategy that I use. So one of the things I'm going to talk about is triple cropping. So what do you do if you want to plant 3 seasons of crops in a bed? So here, now let's talk about just one season, and I still try to keep my beds per family per season. So let's suppose we look at what I might have planted in the fall and the winter. There are certain fava beans that can withstand the winter. So I might plant them in the fall. It's almost like a cover crop, but you may be able to harvest beans in the springtime. So they're in the fall, in the winter. And then I might in the second season, I might plant peas. That's also a legume. And then after the peas are finished, then I might plant green beans. So this whole bed was legumes for that season. And then using another example, spinach is great in the fall and the winter, and beets are great in the spring. So these are in the same family. And now I'm cheating a little bit. After the beets, I might want to plant a long season crop. And the long season crop, that I like, I love parsnips, I love leeks. Those you plant in the summer, but you don't harvest them till maybe even the winter and the spring. And so they're going to be in here for a while. So any of these plants that have a blue box around them, they're in the ground for more than a season. So you're not going to be able to plant in this bed. You're not going to be able to plant. So I planted in the summer. You're not going to be able to plant a fall crop, winter crop in that bed if there was a blue box on any of these, because that season is so long. And here's like cucurbits. Cucurbits, so I'm cheating with this one because I don't know any cucurbits that can withstand the cold. Maybe there are, I just don't know about them. So I might plant in this bed like carrots and green onions in the fall and lettuce in the spring. But my main crop that I'm planning on putting in there are the cucumbers and squash, which I will put in the summer. And then the nightshades is similar. I don't know any nightshades that work in the cold. So I might plant, I mentioned cover crops that fall and winter. I might plant a cover crop like winter rye or that sod buster radish. And then that's going to come out in the spring, and I might just plant the lettuce. Lettuce is a good cheating crop for your rotations because it really is pretty forgiving. But then in the summer, I'll plant my tomatoes and eggplants and peppers. And I'm not going to cheat by planting tomatoes and eggplant and peppers in any of the other beds because I'm not going to be able to keep up a rotation, and the garden hygiene is just going to suffer. And I can't even see what's behind this. I don't know how to get rid of my participants. How do that box doesn't disappear from me. Okay, well, anyway, I'm not seeing what I had in that. I think what I had in there were Asian greens in the fall, Asian greens in the spring, and then Brussels sprouts in the summer. And the Brussels sprouts are a long crop. And if you plant Brussels sprouts in the summer, you're going to expect to harvest in the fall and the winter, and maybe even some of the spring. Okay, I know that's a lot of detail. I'm going to be making this presentation available. I think this is the sort of thing you need to stare at and become one with. But the point is, it's possible if you think ahead of time and plan to have a rotation that makes sense and that keeps par with the garden hygiene, but also allows you to triple crop and get a lot of productivity out of your garden. Okay, so now it's not advancing for me. It was advancing before. I guess it, huh. Oh, there we go. So now another thing you could do to really increase your productivity per unit area is to do vertical gardening. And this shows some beans growing vertically. You can really get a lot of productivity that way. So here's some more. And this, this is showing the design that I kind of ended up with, where I have these metal it's EMT conduit that is on the outside, and I've got these hoops on the inside. And pretty much the only crops that I didn't use row covers for were something that I was going to be growing vertically. And I'm starting some beans here on the left. You can see some beans growing up. I always like to grow these long beans because beans, they're great. They're easy to grow. They're pretty pest resistant. They replenish the soil, but there's so much work to harvest beans. So with these long beans, which can be 1 foot long to 18 inches long, it's just a lot less work to harvest all the beans. And I also thought they taste better from my palate. And you can see I've got a little squash plant growing vertically. Down here, I'm growing sweet potatoes vertically. Anything that's on a vine, you could pretty much grow vertically. I used to, I would put these strings off of this post on the top and just wrap the plants around the string, and that's how they grow up. I also, this shows a sweet potato. This was a 12 square foot area. I got 50 pounds of sweet potato growing it vertically. It was pretty amazing. They were just potato on top of potato. Tomatoes, a lot of people grow their tomatoes in these cages and they don't prune them, and the yield is much less than if you just grow them vertically on just 15 inches between plants. You can grow, get a lot higher productivity.
Did you look at Nike, Adidas, Under Armour? Look at
Deborah?
all the shoe
Deborah?
brands that you can think of.
Your
Wiseman.
I would like to ask people to mute their phones if they wouldn't mind. Thanks. And this shows there are clips that you can get that can, you can clip your tomatoes to these strings, or you can just actually wrap the plant right around the string to have them grow vertically. So let me just spend some time going over the design that I was using, where this writes it out for you. So like in a 12 foot by 3 foot bed, I would have an 8 foot EMT. EMT stands for electrical, mechanical, something or other. You can just get that at Home Depot. They cost about $3.50 for a 10 foot length. And then you can get some elbows, connectors, or you could actually bend the EMT yourself if you want to save a few bucks. And you make a structure. I have rebar buried in here that holds the EMT. So I think I use 4-foot rebar that's sunk 2 feet deep. So this thing is pretty sturdy. And that's every bed I had one of those. So as I'm rotating, I didn't have to really change anything. And now I've got my quick hoops that we discussed before. I used 1/2-inch PVC, schedule 40. They were 7 to 8 foot lengths. They're about buried a foot on each end. And then you can attach your row cover to these pipes with a kind of clip. So let me, I talked about the row covers for keeping the insects out and improving the humidity and such, but they're really great for that season extension. And if you want to grow all year round, that can be important. So when the temperature, I mentioned that the Agribond that I was using gives you 4 degrees of protection. So if it was 32 degrees outside, then the Agribond, stuff probably won't freeze in there till it's 28 degrees. But if you want to go below that, if you want to grow below that, if the temperature goes below that, you might want to have plastic mill. So that plastic mill acts like a greenhouse. And it is actually, you have to be careful, because if it's 40 or 50 degrees outside and you've got that plastic on, it may actually get too hot inside, and it may actually harm the plants because it gets so hot. So it was pretty remarkable. If you've never grown in the wintertime, what a difference just these row covers can make. So the ground never freezes in there. And it was, I was growing some winters where we had some several days of 20 degrees Fahrenheit, and you see all the snow on the ground. The plants are happy as, I don't know if they're happy as clams, but they're happy as little plants. Here's a clip. There are these commercial plastic clips that fit over the EMT, the 3/4 inch EMT, and they also fit the 1/2-inch PVC. It makes it real easy to secure the row covers. I have some pictures under there. Okay, but before we get to that, let me just kind of lay out. This is a very useful table. I know this is a lot of detail, and I don't expect you to absorb it just by looking at it, but if you have a chance and you can download the presentation, you could think about this. It makes sense, because if you triple crop, you really have to keep the end in mind. And this spreadsheet really helped me keep the end in mind. So I divide the production here into 3 phases. There's the starting of the plants, and transplanting, and harvesting. And something that may not have been clear to you is almost all the crops that I grow, I plant in a nursery, and that really helps with the garden, the extending the season. By nursery, I'll show you some pictures. That just means that the plants are grown somewhere else before they're put into your beds. And I think the only plants that I ever direct seed are peas and beans and occasionally squash. Everything else is started elsewhere. So the beds that you have are growing a different crop while you're getting ready to plant that bed. So in my spring crop, I'm starting January, February through March. I am starting the spring crop. And then I'm transplanting it like February, March, April. Probably the only thing I would have transplanted would have been peas. Well, that's not true. Maybe even some of the Asian greens were okay. It really depends on the season. So now you see you've cheated a month. You've gained a month here. You've got plants growing. they're indoors, and other things are in the ground. In fact, your fall winter crop is in the ground while you're got your spring crop started. And now as you're harvesting this fall winter crop, you're opening up room in your beds to transplant your spring crop, which then gets harvested between April and June. But when I say you've got to keep the end in mind, you've really got to make sure everything is out of the ground by July, or you're not going to be able to put your summer crop in. And maybe that's okay. Maybe you've planned for that. Maybe you've got some long season crop and you're not going to put in a summer crop. And leaving it go fallow is okay, or planting a cover crop later is okay. So the idea is that there's a certain window you have to get your spring crop started, a certain window to get your summer crop started, a certain window to get your fall crop started. And notice the fall crop is generally started in July and August. Why is it called the fall crop? Well, it's planted in fall in August and September, but it's really growing through the fall and the winter. And what you want to do, one of the things that limits the growth is not so much how cold it is, but how little light there is. And in December and January, there is so little light that plants that can withstand that cold temperatures pretty much just sit there. So in the fall, what you're trying to do is in the fall crop, you're trying to grow it so that it's mature by December. And that basically what you're doing is you're just harvesting in the fall crop between October and March. So you really have a long harvest season. So pretty much the only thing you're doing out in the garden in the wintertime is harvesting. Let's see if I have some, I don't know why this thing doesn't advance. Okay. I'm gonna stop screen sharing and see if I could get now nothing's happening. Anybody have some advice for me? Nothing I click on my computer is doing anything. I'm pressing the escape button. I am pressing the advance.
Hi, your picture is going a little fuzzy too.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'm a
not,
teacher. Zoom gets a little funky after about an hour-long session.
Oh, I see. So I'm probably talking too much. That's the problem. I don't even know.
Sometimes you just got to give it a little bit of time.
Okay. Sorry, everyone. I'm almost through this too. I don't know. I'm not sure how. Go ahead.
You said you were stopping to share your screen, but it still shows up that as a shared screen.
Yes, I'm pressing the stop share and nothing's happening. I was hoping that if I could get out of the share mode, that I could get to my PowerPoint and advance it or kind of reset things. But I'm not sure that I can. There's nothing that I'm doing. It seems like my computer has frozen. I'm not sure what to do. How about if I take some questions? Oh, look at all the questions here. Let's do questions. How's that? If I wanted to speed up the process and add some earthworms that I get from the store, how many worms do I need for a 4x8 bed? Well, that's a great question. And raises a topic that I forgot to mention when I was talking about the compost buckets. So the kind of buckets, the kind of worms that you normally buy for composting, they don't like to go out into your bed, and they like to live near the surface. And generally, if you put them into a compost pail, they will not leave your compost pail. And so I'm not sure whether you can buy the kinds of earthworms that naturally occur in the soil. So, so that's one part of the answer. This is to Jenny, that I don't really know the answer to. Then a second part that I don't know the answer to, like to a, to a 4 by 8 foot bed. See, I guess the more you add, the more worms you add, the more things are going to happen fast. But also, if the worms are happy, they're going to keep dividing. So it's also a question of, are you using your money wisely by, adding lots of worms? And there are a lot of animals that eat worms, like raccoons like to eat worms. So I'm not a big proponent of buying worms to just put into my garden. I'm a big proponent of, if you add shredded leaves to your garden in the fall, you are going to have worms everywhere. And that's what I would recommend, and not even trying to add those. And like I say, I'm not sure that you can even buy the kind of worms that are in the ground. Maybe you can, but the composting worms are, the red wigglers, they're not really good they don't like to burrow very deep in your garden. Okay, are your kitchen scraps purely raw as you would put in a compost pile, or more varied organic matter as in vermenting? And I'm not sure if that's, you were talking about is vermenting, vermicompost?
It could be. There's a fellow named Mark Payne who does what he calls vern venting, where he, in a sealed bucket, he uses red wrigglers, and he uses all of his organic matter. And I mean, if you'll forgive me, urine, steak bones, humanure, the chipmunk that the dog killed, the squirrel that drowned in the pool, wraps all of this stuff up and drops in a couple thousand red wrigglers, and 8 weeks later he's got a 5-gallon bucket of worm castings.
Okay, I don't really know about that. And I am I've been doing this for a little over a year now, so I don't have a lot of experience with it. But I can tell you what I'm doing. I'm just adding kitchen scraps like I would add to any worm bin. Okay. And I don't add meat. I don't add dairy. I just add kitchen scraps, and I also add things like napkins and paper, and then I've got all sorts of shredded paper that I add to put between the layers. Sure. I'm seeing that the compost that I'm getting, part of it is very wet, but also it's very kind of slimy. And so I wanted to see what happens if I added some more fiber to it. So I was thinking I was adding almost all greens, in other words. And so I'm adding about 2 to 1 browns now. And I haven't had a chance to see the results yet. Yeah, it sounded like bokashi. I was thinking that same thing. There's someone who said, that's Gina Lisa, about bokashi composting. And it did sound like bokashi to me, where you just add lots of stuff. And I thought with bokashi that it's anaerobic, and then
It is anaerobic. I do it in my kitchen.
You do? Okay. Well, why don't you talk a little bit about it? Why don't I give you the floor to talk about
yeah, sure. I buy EM1, which is a microorganism inoculant that you can use in your garden and in your compost, and you mix it with wheat germ. to sort of encourage growth of the microorganisms, and you mix it in a sealed container with your food scraps, and it microorganism grows, does the first cycle of breakdown of your waste, and then you can add it to your compost, or you can bury it in your garden, and then the following season it's completely decomposed, and the nutrients are available for plants.
That was exactly my understanding, that bokashi was like a first step, and that then you composted additionally after that.
Yeah, it's really easy though, and it doesn't smell at all. And like she said, you can put pretty much anything in there. I'm not that brave. I keep it to my food scraps, but yeah, you don't have to worry as much about disease, because everything is totally broken down by the microorganisms that are in EM1.
Very cool. So I have a follow-up question though for our producer. When you talked about the buckets that you got and you drilled the small holes in them and you buried them in the ground, you must also put holes in the bottom?
Actually, you know, I didn't, but I probably wouldn't hurt to do it when I did it. I wasn't sure if I wanted to be pulling those buckets out. So I didn't drill holes in the bottom, but it wouldn't hurt to drill holes in the bottom. I know even some people even leave the bottom open. I don't think that's a good idea, but you could drill holes in the bottom. I think that would be fine.
You sealed the top of it, so you filled, in other words, filled the bucket with composting, with organic matter.
Yes, and then I put the lid over it, and I pressed the lid. I pressed the lid down so that animals aren't going to get into it. And then those hey, who's singing? And then on top of the covers, those were just ceramic tiles. I wanted to weight things down a bit. I don't think they're really doing very much of anything, but I intend to be making cement stepping stones, which are going to have some more weight, so that then that also be another barrier in case I don't get the lids fastened very well. I've only had one time that an animal got into one of those things. So usually those lids held pretty well.
And then do you repeat that process, empty the buckets and put a new in every season, every month? How does that go?
So I have 19 of those buckets. So that means I can put a new bag of kitchen scraps in there about 3 times a year.
Okay.
And
great.
what I found is that it pretty much disappears. Like, so when my bag I use a paper grocery bag that I pretty much fill up in a week, and then that my pail can eat that bag of compost and shredded paper, and it pretty much fills it up. But then when I come back to the second time, it's pretty much 90% of it is gone. And that just may be composting, or it may be that some of it is actually getting out into the garden, which is what it looks like because of the color of the soil is changing.
Okay, great.
But yeah. So then you ask, do I ever go in there? So like this spring was the first time I tried doing that, and I emptied stuff out, and then it was really wet, so I'm drying it out and sifting it. And then when I put plants in and I want to add some compost to, like say I'm planting dahlias, which like compost, I have some for that. But most of the time for a whole year, I had never had to empty them because the compost was disappearing very substantially. Okay, so I think we covered, there's some more questions down below. Let's see. Very interesting, thanks. Sorry, it was my son singing. No problem, he sounds good. Okay, let's see if I can advance yet. Nope, I still can't advance. Let's see if I can stop sharing. I can't. I'm not sure what I'm going to do here.
I have another question.
Sure.
So I work in a school garden, and we have Bermuda grass everywhere. It is awful. I don't know if anybody else has encountered it in the city, and it's just taking over more and more. I'm really interested in no-till, but our previous attempts at that have been ruined basically by the Bermuda grass, because whether we cover it, you know, to kill, like it puts out rhizomes.
Yep.
And it grows, you know, like it's almost impossible to do that. So I wonder if you had any recommendations for, yeah, getting rid of Bermuda grass, or at least creating a big enough perimeter so that it doesn't take over, because it also is so happy when you revise your soil and put compost. It will very quickly take that over.
That is a good example. We had lots of Bermuda grass in our garden, and I don't know that the problem with Bermuda grass is that it can grow like 10 or 20 feet underground. And so if you put these pieces of cardboard to block it, it can just keep growing. So it depends how big an area you're trying to rehabilitate. To be honest, I actually pulled the Bermuda grass out where I had it. I don't know that I was ever able to successfully sheet using that sheet method to just get rid of Bermuda grass. So I think you probably need to pull it.
I honestly just wanted to hear someone say that, because someone tried to tell me that you could no-till Bermuda grass, and I just
No.
No, you
Is that
can't.
the same as wiregrass?
Yes.
Okay. So yes, I agree with you. Here's my little tip for what it's worth. I'm 63, so my hands aren't as strong as they used to be. So I have designated one pair of needle nose pliers that I use for weeding. And it's particularly effective with wiregrass because you can just sink that way down in there, take a big bite. And if your soil is wet, you've got a better chance of pulling up a longer stretch of it.
Yeah, if you, you know, with no-till, when farmers use no-till, they're usually using it in association with some other weed control technique. Most of them use herbicides.
Mm-hmm.
Some people use flame, but, or, you know, you can, if you are very persistent, you can pretty much get rid of it and then do this no-till.
The other thing we've had some success with, but we've done it with raised beds, but you could maybe try it with just, you know, a bed in the ground, is basically, you know, removing as much of the grass as we could, and then laying down painter's paper, and then laying down commercial duty weed block fabric. And then we typically will line the bottom of our raised beds with hardware cloth, which is just basically like a galvanized,
yep,
like, you know, kind of
a mesh
wire almost.
right.
Yeah. And then basically put then the dirt and everything into that, which is a super pain in the butt, but
well, that will might also keep some of the rodents out too with the hardware cloth.
But that can, you know, I mean, that's kind of what it takes to get rid of such a pervasive and invasive grass. And it's a lot of effort, but then, you know, basically you kind of prevent it from getting it in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
But if you don't do that, if you just put the raised bed down, even if you remove all the grass, it will fill up that bed eventually. So you have to kind of line.
Would solarizing the ground help to get rid of Bermuda? I think so. Yeah, if you used, some people do that. I guess it depends what your, you know, temperatures are in that summer, but, you know, if you put clear plastic over it, it could get pretty hot for the whole summer. You know, I've never tried to do that, but it might help. You know, beets don't normally grow 10 feet unless they've, you know, you've got the right kind of bed. I've never seen my beets grow that deep. And so, you know what, you typically have a hard pan, and beetroots, I don't think, are able to penetrate that. And, you know, maybe if you plant radishes over and over again, maybe they'll eventually be able to work through that. I guess it depends if it's just packed clay, or if you've actually got some solid rock underneath. You know, they might be able to penetrate the packed soil, but if you've got a sheet of rock down below, that it's not going to get down that far.
Could I ask two quick questions?
Absolutely.
Okay, so one, you had mentioned rodents, and I'm sure a lot of us, being that this is DC, are dealing with rat problems in our garden. I had, in the fall, rats really ate like all of my brassica seedlings, except for the arugula. I think they don't like the arugula because it's spicy, so those were fine. But I was wondering, do you have any tips for you know, keeping rats out of the garden in general?
Wow. Yeah, I actually haven't had that kind of a problem myself. I don't know what to say about that. You know, people were talking about hardware cloths. I mean, is it only a certain time of the season, or is it persistent?
It seems to be just the fall. Like our spring brassicas, right now they've been fine all spring. They're doing fine. So I don't know if it's, you know, a scarcity of some of other things for them to eat at that time of year, but they really kind of overran our community garden in the fall specifically.
That is such a shame. No, I don't know, unless you enclose it with like the hardware cloth and the row covers. If they're really, you could have hardware cloth on the bottom and the sides, and you could have row covers, and that might help reduce their entry into it. But even when you open that up to work in it, they're small, and they might find their way in. So I don't really have a good strategy for that.
Okay, yeah, I guess plant arugula is the answer that I've come up with so far. But my other quick question was related to the crop rotation that you were talking about. So in our garden, the plots are all pretty small. So my entire plot is just 11 by 7. So I was wondering, if you don't have separate beds really that you can rotate your crops through, does it make a difference if you just rotate where in the bed you're planting your different crops each year?
That is a great question, and I would do that. Yes, I would rotate where you're putting it in the bed, and that at least that's helping. At least it's not in the exact same spot, and so I would do that. I would do that, even if you just have one bed.
Okay, thank you.
Let's see. There's someone. Okay, so yeah, unfortunately, I got this nice chat box, but I can't. Things. I don't know if other people can see the chat box. I can see the very last one. So here's Megan. If you have super invasive grass you're trying to avoid taking over the beds, many of our raised beds are just planted directly over the ground, and don't worry about liners. Okay. So I don't know if someone else wants to read if there's a question on there. I can't see, that was a comment. I can't, because I've kind of lost, I may have to shut my computer down in order to get it back. Are there other questions there?
Yeah, there was a question about hardware cloth and landscape fabric. If you put it on the bottom of a raised bed, does that prevent root growth?
I think the roots will grow through the hardware cloth. The hardware cloth generally is like a 1/4 inch to a 1/2 inch holes. Yeah, they'll grow right through that. But you know, one of the things I don't like about hardware cloth is that it'll rust, and then it seems like whatever, if there's a downside to rust in your soil, you've got that, you know. And also you know, you're limiting the depth to which you can take advantage of the ground below it. But there are definitely upsides, like you mentioned, if you're keeping the rodents out. Well, any other questions? I'm sorry I couldn't finish the presentation. I think I was getting close to the end and I didn't talk about containers. I don't know, are anybody interested? I could just talk a little bit about the containers if anyone is interested, or I see we got a yes.
Yeah, that sounds great. And can I just ask if there's time, can you talk more about the companion planting? Because I think we kind of jumped over that.
Okay. Okay, I could talk a little bit about companion. One of the things, some of the things I was going to mention, you know, I had some slides. I think they're very helpful in terms of the triple cropping, is that you can see how you can really cheat when, like, say you have the spring, I might have Asian greens that are in the ground, but I want to get my tomatoes in. We're heading towards the end of May, and I want to get my tomatoes in the ground. And as you're harvesting your Asian greens, you can start putting your tomatoes, which are small at that point. And so it's kind of acting like a companion as well when you're doing that intercropping. The other and I had some other examples of, like, say you have something like Brussels sprouts that are growing and now it's in the fall, and those are pretty big. They haven't gotten as big as they can get yet, and then there might be room on the sides to plant something like carrots and green onions. If you get to see my presentation, you know, there'll be pictures of that. And in terms of I wasn't really going to mention much else about companion planting other than what I had said about, I like planting flowers to attract pollinators. And the kinds of plants that I like, you know, I always like planting marigolds around the tomatoes. You know, marigolds have some, help keep nematodes out. So if you've got crops that are sensitive to nematodes, they're a good plant to put in as a companion. And I like planting, there's something called blanket flower. You guys familiar with that? It's a really pretty flower. It's kind of low prostate, and it's a good for attracting pollinators. You know, so I didn't really have much else that I wanted to say about that. Did you have anything specific questions?
No, thank you. I appreciate that. And I'm sorry to interrupt the question about the container garden.
No. So if you don't have a garden like a garden plot, which was my case when I first moved to DC, I was just looking for any place I could plant plants. And one of the places that turned out to be pretty good for me that was sunny was the tree boxes that were in the front of my house. And I have some really nice pictures of the tree boxes that the boxes that I built for the tree boxes. And many of you sound like you're familiar with putting together, like say 4x4s to make a garden bed. And I put them on the tree box, and I could grow really nice flowers out there. It's not really a great place to grow vegetables because it's so close to the traffic. But then I had a little balcony behind my house, and it was so limited by sun, but I was able to grow things like tomatoes and peppers, which usually you need a lot of sun for that. But if you can grow like cherry tomatoes or some of the smaller peppers. And one of the best things, one of the problems that I had when I first grew plants in containers was that they would dry out so fast. And so I might have like a 3-gallon or a 2 or 3 gallon pot, which is a pretty big pot, and it would need to be watered twice a day, and I wasn't around to water it, so it just didn't grow. And so you may be familiar with these self-watering planters. I made one on the cheap by just taking a 5-gallon bucket, and my 2-gallon container just sat in there. And now some people put wicks out of the bottom of the soil to go into the water, and I found you don't even need that. That like the tomatoes are sending roots into the water, and those are acting as wicks. And I got these most amazing tomatoes and peppers that I had ever gotten just by switching to these self-watering containers. So the 5-gallon bucket, basically what you would do is you would drill a hole in the side that's say about the same level as the bottom of your insert container. Too bad I don't have my pictures. And it's so simple to set up. It's just, if you just got a container, soil container that sits in your bucket, figure out where the bottom of the water level is and then drill a hole. You do that so you don't flood your bucket when it rains. So then the water will come out through that hole. And now you have a reservoir for your container that's several gallons, and the roots grow into that water and the plants grow really well. And so then you only need to water every couple days rather than twice a day. So I was getting pretty good tomatoes, cherry tomatoes and peppers that way. So that's pretty much what I can say about containers. Oh, the other container. You know, gutters make great containers for lettuce. I don't know if you've seen pictures of this. You can see them on like Home Depot. And there are pictures of, and in the presentation, there are pictures of people who had attached gutters along the side of their house, and then they use it as a vertical garden. So then you would say the lettuce grows maybe a foot tall. So now maybe two feet above the gutter, you put another gutter. And so you can really get a lot of plants in a small space in a container, and that could be on the side of your house. But the big problem for me, and it's probably for you as well, growing around your house is it's light limited. You just don't have enough light. Like neighbors' houses were blocking the light, trees were blocking the light. So you're somewhat limited about what you can do. Next week, I'm giving a presentation about growing plants in your basement with hydroponics. And if you don't have a nice plot outside, I encourage you to listen to that presentation, because that's what I have here in Richmond now. I don't have any sun, and I'm growing about 16 lettuce or green plants a week just in my basement in lights in a 2x4 foot area. So that's a commercial plug for next week.
Great.
Any other questions? I'm trying to remember what I had in my presentation that I missed, but so be it. Well, if not, thank you so much for joining me. I hope everyone stays well. Be careful out there and enjoy your gardening.